Hello. Donc, je lis pas le début du truc, mais ça donnait. A few issues must be clarified. For a start, we need to say something about what jazz works are. Note the difference between giving an account of what a work of jazz is and giving a definition of jazz. We have no intention of defining a phenomenon as complex and multifarious as jazz. It would be difficult indeed to come up with a definition that embraces Dixieland, ragtime, bebop, cool jazz, free jazz, and the many other styles. We will simply assume that readers have a rough and ready conception of jazz. They know jazz when they hear it. Instead of defining jazz, we wish simply to say a few words about what a work of jazz is, without entering into the debates generated in the vast and varied literature on the ontology of works of art in general and works of music in particular. Before we can begin to talk about how two jazz performances can be instances of the same type, we need some conception of a work of jazz. The works of some musical styles are easy enough to identify. In classical music, a work is a composition produced by a composer and recorded in a score. Handel's Acis and Galatea, for example, is reasonably described as a score that serves as a recipe for generating patterns of sound or performances. Sometimes jazz scores exist. Such scores can exist prior to all performances, or they can exist as transcriptions of performances. The transcription of classic performances for pedagogical purposes is quite common. There will be a temptation to describe these scores as works of jazz. At best, however, an account of jazz works in terms of scores must be incomplete. It is incomplete since improvisation is a common feature of many jazz performances. It is possible to overestimate how important improvisation is to jazz and to say that works of jazz are essentially improvised. In fact, improvisation is neither necessary nor sufficient for some things being a work of jazz. It is not sufficient since improvisation is an important part of other styles of music, including the Baroque. It is not necessary since some jazz performances are simply realizations of a score. As well, some jazz performances are reproductions of classic performances that have been learned by ear. The young Charlie Parker, for example, memorized and recapitulated the improvisations of Lester Young. The result, presumably, was jazz. Nevertheless, improvisation is a common and important feature of jazz performances, and a satisfactory account of a jazz work must be able to accommodate improvisation. Even if improvisation is not essential to jazz, the existence of jazz improvisation certainly complicates the effort to give an account of a work of jazz. It is possible to hold that many jazz performances exist without corresponding to an existing jazz work. Paul Thum has argued that an improvised performance is not or is not necessarily a work. His position follows from his account of works in the performing arts. Roughly, his view is that such works are instructions for executing performances. Thumb recognizes that a record of an improvised performance can be transformed into a set of directives for generating performances, that is, into a work in his sense. We will not take a stance on Thumb's claim that improvisations are not necessarily works. There is something odd about saying that an improvisation is not a work, but we are prepared to allow that some jazz performances may exist without corresponding works. Completely spontaneous performances by Keith Jarrett might be examples of such performances. We maintain, however, that some improvised jazz performances have a corresponding work. For example, over and above the improvised performances given by Monk and Davis, there is the work Round Midnight. The object corresponding to both performances of Round Midnight can be called a jazz standard or a number. These jazz standards provide instructions for creating performances. In this sense, a jazz standard is a work. Not every jazz performance has a corresponding jazz standard. A complete metaphysics of jazz has to give differing accounts of jazz performances that have and do not have a corresponding jazz standard. Great many jazz performances have, however, a corresponding number. A large part of our project is an account of these objects. We also need to clarify the concept of improvisation. Only given a satisfactory analysis of this concept can we understand how jazz performances can be instances of the same jazz standard. It is worth noting that our account of how two jazz performances can be instances of the same work must be very different from one that Nelson Goodman would offer. Goodman adopts a strict account of what makes two performances instances of the same work. On this view, only when two performances completely comply with the score are they instances of the same work. A less strict criterion of the instantiation of works, he believes, leaves open the possibility that performances of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Three Blind Mice instantiate the same work. After all Goodman reasons, we could have a series of performances differing from each other only by one note. At one end of the series is a performance that perfectly complies with Beethoven's score. At the other end is one that conforms to the score of the folk tune. Goodman's account, even when applied to classical music, is controversial. Still, two performances of a classical composition could meet his criterion and instantiate the same work. By Goodman's standards, however, two jazz performances will seldom instantiate the same work. Goodman probably did not have jazz in mind when he developed his account of the instantiation of musical works. Consequently, it is not surprising that, on his view, two jazz performances never instantiate the same work. If complete compliance with the score is necessary for the instantiation of a work, jazz performances will seldom be instances of the same work. The problem is not that the two jazz performances of some standard are never note for note identical. Goodman's position does not commit him to saying that two performances are only instances of the same work when they are hmm? to saying that two performances are only instances of the same work when they are note for note identical. He allows that a score can allow room for improvisation. A Baroque composition with a figured bass, for example, allows such scope. The problem is that many jazz performances do not conform to a score that allows scope for improvisation. Rather, they are not realizations of scores at all. If we are to make sense of the claim that two jazz performances coinstantiate some work, we will have to come up with an alternative to Goodman's position. Although we are primarily concerned with jazz performances, we expect that our conclusions will apply to other musical genres that involve improvisation. In the Baroque period, improvisation by professional musicians was common. An Elizabethan lutenist would improvise on a standard tune, such as Lacrimae or Greensleeves. Later, La Folia d'Espagne and other Baroque standards were common starting points for improvisation. Many early 17th century compositions exist in written form only because amateur musicians could not improvise and they needed a written score. Several manuals on how to improvise were written during the Baroque period, including Christopher Simpson's The Division of Viol. We would hold that two performances of say, Greensleeves can be instances of a type. In this case, the type is an Elizabethan standard. 2. In order to see that jazz performances can be instances of the same work, we need an understanding of improvisation. Improvisation has sometimes been defined as completely spontaneous performance. A completely spontaneous performance is executed without reference to directions such as score, a sketch, or memories of past performances. Certainly, any completely spontaneous performance is an improvisation. However, a definition of improvisation in terms of complete spontaneity is far too restrictive. The harpsichordist who realizes a figured bass not on this account improvising. Neither is the violinist who extemporaneously performs a cadenza that incorporates a theme from the concerto she or he is performing. Most importantly, for present purposes, most jazz performances are not improvisations in the sense of being completely spontaneous. We suggest that an improvised performance is one in which the structural properties of a performance are not completely determined by decisions made prior to the time of performance. In clarifying this definition, we need to begin by explaining what we mean by structural properties. The structural properties of a performance include its melody, harmony, and length, in bars, not in temporal duration. A structural property is to be understood in contrast to an expressive or interpretive property. The expressive properties of a performance include tempo, the use of rubato, dynamics, and so on. We believe that the line between expressive and structural properties is a fuzzy one, but it must be drawn if we are to avoid the conclusion that virtually every musical performance involves improvisation. A few examples will clarify this point. A concert pianist who performs a Beethoven sonata does not improvise. The pianist creates a performance with the structural properties demanded by Beethoven's score. The pianist is not improvising since she or he follows Beethoven's score, and even if a few mistakes creep in, the performance closely approximates what the score demands. Even if the player spontaneously adds rubato or varies the tempo, she or he is not improvising. She or he is not improvising since she or he is simply varying the expressive properties of the work. The structural properties of the pianist's performance may vary um, wait, from those specified in the score as a result of mistakes without the performance being an improvisation. Such inadvertent departures do not make a performance an improvisation since the performer was attempting to follow a score. Improvisation occurs only when performers do not attempt to make the structural properties of a work conform to a score. Ah, la référence, c'est en fait c'est un article. C'est un article, hello, qui s'appelle alors je vais donner le titre. Là j'étais à la page 4. Qui s'appelle The Metaphysics of Jazz de James O. Young et Carl Matheson. Voilà. Dans The Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. Volume 58, numéro 2, Improvisation in the Arts. Page 125-133. Voilà, comme ça vous avez les références exactes. D'accord, c'est drôle. Bah, j'espère que. Alors, je suis désolée, c'est un live en mode total schlag, hein. C'est souvent comme ça les lives. Voilà, je suis en pyjama le Roi Lion. Mais en fait, je fais mon mémoire sur l'improvisation en jazz, en philosophie de l'art et de l'esthétique. Super. Et il y a des articles comme ça que je trouve intéressants, que je lis de temps en temps. Et c'est aussi une manière pour moi, franchement, de travailler. Mais je me dis, tant qu'à faire, autant de travailler plus efficacement. Et tant qu'à faire, autant que faire profiter les autres, quoi. Voilà, d'autant que c'est un article relativement court. Et du coup, sur cette chaîne, il y a de la philo, mais il y a aussi du chant, de la danse, tout ça, tout ça. Alors, je retiens ce truc, enfin donc improvisation occurs only when performers do not attempt to make the structural properties of a work conform to a score. Et du coup, comment vous êtes, ou tu es, je ne sais pas, tombé sur cette chaîne? Enfin, j'imagine que du coup, vous ou tu, je ne sais pas. Ah OK, Facebook. Comment ça Facebook? Mais on est amis sur Facebook? Mais du coup, je vais te tutoyer, enfin, OK. Mais du coup, tu es d'abord tombée sur mon compte Facebook sans être amie Facebook et ensuite sur ma chaîne. C'est ça. Et on a qui comme ami en commun? Faut que je boive, mais elle est trop loin ma bouteille. Ah sérieux? Mais c'est trop drôle. Mais est-ce que tu serais pas le batteur? Mais oui! Je vois, 2 fois en plus, je crois. Ou peut-être dans un autre, Ah mais c'est trop drôle du coup! OK, OK, OK. Bah oui, du coup, je comprends que ça t'intéresse. Heu, mais du coup, tu fais de la philosophie, en plus de la flûte ou pas? En études? En attendant ta réponse, je lis un peu la suite. A performer who spontaneously chooses structural properties is improvising. For example, a lutenist ça c'est arrivé avec, Ella Fitzgerald, à Juan-les-Pins. For example, a lutenist who extemporizes a repeat while playing a pavan by Dowland is improvising. The structural properties of the lutenist's performance were not completely determined by an attempt to follow a score. Decisions she or he made while playing affected more than just the expressive properties of the performance. Still, the performance was not completely spontaneous. Given that the lutenist is performing, say, the Lacrimae Pavan, the varied repeat cannot assume just any form. This example demonstrates that an improvisation need not be completely spontaneous. Many jazz performances are similarly improvised even though they are not completely spontaneous. For example, when Miles Davis played Round Midnight, the performance was not completely spontaneous. Davis would begin with the statement of a standard melody. Before he began to perform, Davis was aware of this melody and made a successful effort to state it. To this extent, his performance was not completely spontaneous. After playing in a statement of the melody, Davis would play improvised variations. His accompanists knew they were expected to play certain standard chord progressions, over which Davis could improvise. The accompanists could play what jazz musicians call alternate chords. For example, a C ninth chord, C E G B flat D, is an alternate for a G minor seventh chord, G B flat D F. Nevertheless, given that they were performing "Round Midnight" rather than another number, only certain chords could be played. The musicians knew what these chords were before they began to play. So their performance was not completely spontaneous, any more than was Davis's. Nevertheless, the performance was improvised. 3. As we have seen, jazz musicians can be improvising even when they do not start from scratch. Ok, cool. Ok. Ah ouais, pourquoi des machines? Quand j'ai vu ça, mon Dieu, c'était la deuxième année de prépa où, où le thème c'était, bah, l'art, la technique et ouais, sujet: «Pourquoi des machines?» Il va vraiment falloir que je boive de l'eau par contre. Et là, la première réaction logique, c'est que je t'en pose des questions moi et ensuite on travaille et en fait ça va. Mais c'est des questions, ouais, j'ai eu l'année dernière en oral Donc j'ai 1 heure pour préparer, je dois parler 15 minutes et ensuite 5 minutes de questions. J'ai eu mince. Ah oui, y a-t-il plusieurs demeures intérieures? Voilà. Comment ça, est-ce que ça m'arrive de revenir sur ces sujets? Je reviens avec ma bouteille d'eau. Bon, je me replace. Hem, bah, bah, de toute façon, la disserte, c'est un exercice. Donc il faut une première partie, une deuxième partie, une troisième partie. En gros, la troisième partie est la conclusion. Ah, ça, c'était une question que j'ai eue l'année dernière. Mais ouais, en gros, ce que je défends, je suis la partie avec laquelle je suis d'accord, en gros, c'est plutôt ce que je défends en troisième partie et en conclusion. Même si dans les premières parties, c'est jamais le contraire de la deuxième et la troisième, c'est simplement, la deuxième et la troisième sont un approfondissement de la première. Mais du coup, en gros, en plus, il y a pas beaucoup d'années qui se sont écoulées entre, le moment où j'ai rédigé ces dissertes et mon alors, par exemple, les dissertes que j'ai faites en terminale, j'en ai peut-être posté lu certaines aussi, je sais pas. Ouais, il y en a une, bah, celle que j'ai fait au bac, je sais que je l'ai lue. Je l'écrirais, certainement autrement maintenant. C'est-à-dire ouais, il y a des choses que je modifierais, mais celles que j'ai faites il y a 1, 2, 3 ans, non, pour l'instant, je les referais pareil aujourd'hui. Dans 5 ans, je les ferais certainement différemment, mais aujourd'hui, non. Après, le principe de la philo, c'est que tout est après, faut bien comprendre ce mot, mais c'est-à-dire c'est de douter, donc en gros, je suis toujours ouverte à la discussion, et à la remise en question des idées, mais surtout à la complétude de la non-exhaustivité, en gros, de ces idées-là, bien sûr. Mais ouais, voilà, donc this account of improvisation contains the clue to understanding how two jazz performances can instantiate the same work. Two jazz performances are instances of the same type when they share a common starting point in a loose set of tacit instructions. Ça, je copie-colle dans ma boîte à citations. Any performance that in that je sais pas, c'est bizarre, il y a marqué any performance that in is accord with a given set of guidelines is an instance of a jazz standard. The mere fact that two jazz performances closely resemble each other does not establish that they co-instantiate the same work. In a limiting case, two performances could be note for note identical and not instantiate the same number. As we have said, co-instantiation depends on conformity to some tacit guidelines. Imagine that some performers accept certain guidelines and perform round midnight. Some other performers, who are ignorant of the guidelines in question, give a spontaneous and indistinguishable performance. The performances are indistinguishable in the sense that someone hearing recordings of both would not be able to tell them apart. The performance given by the second set of musicians does not instantiate the round midnight Davis played. This is because only musicians who follow a set of instructions, however loose, can create a performance that instantiates the work in question. Ça, c'est un peu la question des indiscernables d'Arthur Danto, appliquée au jazz. C'est intéressant ce passage. Tac. Ok. Quelle discipline? Quelles autres disciplines? It is even possible that two sets of performers follow a set of tacit guidelines, produce indistinguishable performances, but give performances that do not instantiate the same work. We can see this is possible if we consider Twin Jazz Club. This club, j'ai mal à la nuque. This club is located on Twin Earth, a planet very like Earth but causally unconnected to our planet. Some musicians in Twin Jazz Club may follow the guidelines indistinguishable from those Miles Davis followed when he performed Round Midnight. Davis's doppelganger may even blow the same notes and call the work he performs Round Midnight. Still, the performance in Twin Jazz Club does not instantiate Round Midnight. The performance does not follow the right set of guidelines. There are different guidelines since they originate at different times and places. Only a performance that follows the guidelines that originated at a certain time and place can instantiate Round Midnight or any other jazz work. The position adopted here is parallel to a position Peter Kivey has adopted on the metaphysics of compositions in classical music. He considers whether Beethoven's Opus 38 and Opus 20 are two works or one. Beethoven arranged the septet Opus 20 for clarinet, cello, and piano and gave it a new opus number. Kivey adopts the view that they are not distinct works. He holds that they are versions of the same work. Kivey does not really give reasons for thinking that Opus 38 and Opus 20 are not separate works. He just says that no musician would think they are distinct works. Presumably, however, he thinks that the trio version is a recapitulation of musical ideas that were already present in the septet. For this reason, they are not a distinct work. Kivey's approach can be extended to cover versions, using Kivey's word, of a jazz standard. There are some differences between the case Kivey considers and the case of two jazz performances. For a start, Kivey is concerned with two scores and not two performances. Moreover, different versions of jazz standards often have different composers, while in Kivey's case, we are dealing with a single composer. Still, the cases seem parallel. In both cases, we have alternative developments of core musical ideas. That the ideas are worked out in a performance in one case and on paper in the other seems inessential. The fact that jazz versions of the same work can have multiple composers seems similarly inessential. Kivey would probably say that Mozart's keyboard concerto K107 No. 1 is not a work distinct from G.C. Bach's sonata Opus 5 No. 2. Rather, Mozart's K107 No. 1 is simply the concerto version of the sonata since it essentially repeats Christian Bach's musical ideas. The most significant difference between two jazz performances and the examples just canvassed remains to be examined. Two versions of a jazz standard often differ more than Beethoven's Opus 38 and Opus 20 do, though they need not. Jazz performers develop ideas captured in a set of tacit instructions, but they often introduce new ideas of their own. Performers of a jazz standard allow themselves considerable freedom when they choose tempo, key, instrumentation, variations of the melody, duration, and so on. Performers could say, add a piano line to a number that never had one before and still produce an instance of the number. At a certain point, however, a line is crossed and we no longer have an instance of the original standard. In the next section, we will examine in some detail how performances that differ quite considerably can be instances of the same number. For les sciences, ok. Effectivement, oui, c'est. Ouais, on devrait faire plus de philosophie dans les filières scientifiques, ouais. OK. Ah, j'habitais pendant 3 ans, j'ai habité juste à côté, parce que j'étais à Henri IV. Donc j'habitais rue Pierre et Marie Curie. Au 10, numéro 10, porte 10 et je suis née le 10/10/01. C'était rigolo. Ouais, effectivement. Je trouve pas, c'est surtout que ça devrait être enseigné beaucoup plus tôt, parce qu'on a trop de choses à faire en 1 an. J'ai une élève, moi je donne des cours particuliers, j'ai une élève qui a, oui, après il y a des bons et des mauvais profs, hein, comme dans tout. Heu, Comme je propose aussi des cours à partir de 12-13 ans. Il y a la petite sœur, qui a 13 ans, la petite sœur d'un élève qui a demandé à faire avec moi. Honnêtement, elle dit des choses beaucoup plus intéressantes que certains de mes camarades en terminale. Donc on peut vraiment commencer beaucoup plus tôt. 12-13 ans, ça me paraît bien. On peut même commencer plus tôt, mais c'est une autre approche et j'aurais du mal, j'avoue, moi personnellement, heu, je saurais pas trop quelle approche avoir, mais à partir de 12-13 ans, on est tout à fait capable, d'une certaine abstraction, philosophique. Même si la philosophie, c'est très concret, hein, mais du raisonnement. On est capable de tirer l'abstrait du concret, on va dire. Heu et donc, section 4. As we have seen, jazz performances are frequently not completely spontaneous, even when they involve improvisation. The spontaneity is not complete, since jazz musicians accept, prior to beginning to perform, a starting point. These starting points are loose sets of tacit guidelines, and these guidelines constitute a jazz standard. That is, a number is defined by a loose set of tacit instructions, and when these instructions are violated, a performance is not an instance of that number. The guidelines can be quite loose and can provide musicians with a great deal of scope. They provide far more scope than is permitted, for example, by a figured bass. Nevertheless, the performer who opts to follow the guidelines is under some constraints. If these constraints are violated, the performer is no longer performing a particular jazz standard. A complete specification of these guidelines is difficult to provide. However, we can begin with the discussion of what we shall call the canonical model. According to the canonical model, a jazz number has 5 parts. These are the introduction, the head, the section in which the melody is stated, the improvisations, the recapitulation of the head, and the ending. Furthermore, according to the canonical model, 2 jazz numbers are instances of the same work just in case their heads contain the same melody and the improvisations are based on the chord changes of the head. Oula, j'avais ma propre salive de travers. The introductions and the endings are not relevant to work identity in canonical cases. In cases to which the canonical model applies, the specification of the 5 parts of a jazz number is the set of guidelines that defines a jazz work. 2 performances that follow such guidelines instantiate the same work. Not all jazz works can be encompassed by the canonical model. Nevertheless, conformity to the canonical model illustrates how more than one jazz performance can instantiate the same work. Many jazz performances, including most of those by amateurs and players in an average jazz bar, conform to the canonical model. A surprising number of these performances are based on the charts, rudimentary scores that contain only a melody line and chord changes, provided by the real book, a set of unauthorized but ubiquitous volumes. Unauthorized? Which is to current jazz practice what Ptolemy's Almagest was to pre-Copernican astronomical practice. The common reliance on the real book is responsible for a great deal of uniformity in jazz practice, to the extent that several of the errors in transcription that it contains have been perpetuated in the jazz community. Now the question is whether 2 musicians playing from real book charts perform the same work. Imagine that two performers of ordinary ability play the same number from the real book with no revolutionary intentions. If the canonical model was strictly applied, they would not be likely to generate performances that would count as performance of the same work. There are two reasons for this. The first is that although our two performers would be reading the same melody, they would not play melodies that were strictly the same. The differences between the melodies would not merely be ones that we have labeled as expressive. In other words, the difference between them would not be confined to differences of tempo and dynamics. The players would also likely play different notes, where the difference in notes played goes far beyond matters of ornamentation. As an example of this, contrast Monk's version of Round Midnight with Davis's minimalist rendition of the melody, which leaves out many of the notes in Monk's version and many of the notes in the real book chart of the number. Monk's and Davis's versions of the head are structurally different. However, the two versions are readily recognizable as versions of the same melody. Similarly, our two musicians will almost certainly not play exactly the same chords. First, they will voice the chords in different ways. Differences in voicings may seem to be an inessential difference to those who regard different voicings of the same chords as merely differences of inversion, that is, as reflected in different choices for which note is to be played on top. However, different voicing systems actually involve different notes being played, so that what is a C major chord according to one system may be an A minor seventh with suspended fourth on another. Second, our musicians might add or alter the chords in certain ways, for instance by adding flatted tenths or fifths. Third, they may engage in wholesale chord substitution, such as true tone substitution, where, for example, a D flat seventh chord may be substituted for a G seventh chord. By listing these sources of melodic and harmonic difference between numbers, we do not mean to say, for instance, that Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis are performing different works. La manière dont Mais après, attention, c'est-à-dire que quand on pense tout seul, on pense comme tout le monde. Il faut d'abord apprendre un peu des choses, les lire, se les approprier, se rendre compte que c'est quand même d'un certain niveau, pour pouvoir ensuite réellement penser par soi-même. Et puis le principe d'une dissertation, c'est quand même ça, hein, c'est de discuter des idées. Donc, mais souvent, c'est l'idée qu'on s'en fait, plutôt. On a l'impression qu'on doit recracher des idées toutes faites, mais en fait, c'est pas ça l'exercice de la dissertation. Si on fait ça, on a 13-15 grand maximum. Parce qu'on est surnoté. Qu'est-ce que tu entends par actualiser? Les connaissances ne sont pas forcément actualisées. Ça dépend des profs, mais on apprend quand même des grands classiques de la philosophie en terminale normalement, donc c'est plutôt pertinent. Je comprends pas ton dernier message. Je ne pense pas que chercher des informations ailleurs se résume à penser par soi-même. Je comprends pas. Non, je comprends pas le sens de ce message. Tu veux dire que ton prof de philo disait: «C'est comme ça et pas autrement»? Après il y a enfin, ça dépend sur quoi, parce qu'il y a des règles de logique, où c'est comme ça et pas autrement, tu vois? Mais la logique, il y a des règles, pour la partie logique de la philo. Après le reste, on peut débattre, mais il faut que ce soit argumenté, quoi, et exemplifié, toujours. Qu'est-ce qui est vague? Mmh. Mmh. Pardon. Je continue un peu l'article. Jazz musicians and listeners would all agree that Monk and Miles each plays the melody of Round Midnight. That they do play the same melody in spite of the significant difference in the notes they play shows that the concept of melodic equivalence is both more supple and more subtle than anything a strict Goodmanian analysis could countenance. Ça, je copie-colle. Similarly, the concept of harmonic equivalence is, if anything, even looser than that of melodic equivalence. Therefore, for an analysis of work identity in the spirit of the canonical model to succeed, that analysis would have to make us of a rich understanding of both melodic and harmonic equivalence. We assume that broad criterion for melodic and harmonic equivalence can be provided. The fact of the matter is that accomplished jazz musicians and discerning listeners recognize that Monk and Davis are playing the same melody in harmonic changes. Consequently, the canonical model is able to provide a criterion of the identity of jazz works. Tout ça, copier-coller. Hé, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Ah bah bien sûr, mais ça c'est absolument pas interdit, au contraire. Alors, la philosophie, c'est une autre manière d'aborder ces sujets que les neurosciences, mais on peut tout à fait utiliser des données, de nouvelles données des neurosciences et en parler dans des cercles de philo, c'est même très, très bienvenu. Parfois nécessaire quand il s'agit de, par exemple en fait, à partir du moment où on fait une dissertation d'épistémologie, il faut donner des exemples scientifiques. À partir du moment où on fait une dissertation, sur l'art, il faut donner des exemples artistiques, de toute façon. C'est obligatoire. Oui et puis il y a enfin, de toute façon, il y a des textes de philo qui justifient l'esclavage, donc si tu veux évidemment, enfin, il y a, on a évolué quand même, enfin on a évolué. Les sciences ont évolué en je sais pas combien de milliers d'années, mais moralement, on n'a pas forcément évolué. Mais les sciences, oui. Donc forcément, il y a des discours qu'on qu'on ne tient plus parce qu'on n'ose plus les tenir. Je dis bien parce qu'on n'ose plus les tenir, hein, parce qu'évidemment, il y a toujours des esclavagistes et des racistes et des sexistes, donc et des gens qui pensent vraiment qu'il y a des races, genre, enfin, ça existe ces gens-là. Bon, ceux qui essaient de le démontrer par la science, évidemment, ils sont pas beaucoup parce que mais du coup, ça passe par des dire sans dire, quoi. Par rapport à tes ah ouais? Hésite pas si tu te rappelles de son nom. Hem, qu'est-ce que je voulais dire? Ah oui, et sinon, du coup, toi, tu fais quoi? Tu en études supérieures, en flûte? Tu veux être, flûtiste professionnel et tout ou tu en sciences ou les 2? Unfortunately, the canonical model is not a general criterion for the instantiation of identical works of jazz. The reason for this is that several jazz works do not conform to the canonical model. First, several performances of certain jazz works contain incomplete or even fragmentary statements of the relevant melody. For instance, Sonny Rollins' performance of On Green Dolphin Street contains a literal statement of the first 8 bars and of one phrase in the last 8 bars of the 32-bar melody line. Lenny Tristano's performance of All of Me makes no immediately recognizable statement at all of the melody of that number. One may counter this objection in 2 ways. First, one may try to draw a line between Rollins and Tristano by claiming that Rollins' partial statement of the melody of On Green Dolphin Street, in conjunction with an appropriate harmonic equivalence, is sufficient. However, since Tristano does not play any of the melody of All of Me whatsoever, the song he plays is not All of Me, no matter what he calls it. This insistence on at least a partial statement of the melody comes at the cost of a clash with the intuitions most people have. Alors, je lis la suite. Après, je copie-colle un truc. Most people simply accept that Tristano plays All of Me, even though he never states the melody. Of course, theories that begin with our intuitions must often reconstruct those intuitions in the interest of consistency and economy. Consequently, the mere existence of a clash with our everyday intuitions does not give us immediate grounds for the elimination of the partial melody revision. Such clashes with intuition, however, do impel us to look for other theories that enjoy the same theoretical virtues without forcing us to reject our pre-theoretical intuitions. Furthermore, there is a way of preserving our intuition that Tristano plays All of Me. Suppose we were to throw away the melodic equivalence requirement of the canonical model. Suppose, that is, we were to say that 2 numbers were instances of the same work just in case they had the same harmonic structure. According to this revision of the canonical model, what Tristano plays is an instance of All of Me because it conforms to the chord changes of All of Me. What Rollins plays is an instance of On Green Dolphin Street because it has the proper chord changes and the melodic equivalence between it and other versions of On Green Dolphin Street is inessential icing on the cake. In addition to an improved fit with our intuitions, in the Tristano case at least, this reduction of work identity to harmonic structure resonates with a common but dubious belief. According to this belief, improvisation is the soul of most jazz, and improvisations are based on the harmonic structure of a song. According to this view, since the harmonic structure of a work is both its skeleton and the engine for generating new jazz versions of the work, we should recognize that the harmonic structure of a work constitutes its essence. Unfortunately, again, the purely harmonic view is untenable. Although it gives the right... Alors, ça, je copie-colle parce que ça m'intéresse. Although it gives the right answer in the Tristano case, it clashes horribly with our intuitions in others. In jazz, a handful of harmonic patterns are multiply-instantiated. For instance, a great many jazz works are based on a 12-bar blues pattern. A great many others are based on so-called rhythm changes derived from George Gershwin's I've Got Rhythm. According to the purely harmonic view, all performances of a 12-bar blues are performances of the same single work, and all performances on rhythm changes are performances of another work. To say, for instance, that Nat King Cole's Route 66 and Oscar Peterson's Night Train are instances of the same work because they share the same chord changes would strike nearly everybody as absurd. There are elements that distinguish these as separate works despite their harmonic equivalence. Donc tout ça, copier-coller. Et ensuite je regarde ta réponse. Ah ouais, informatique, infirmier, ça n'a rien à voir. Ok. Ok. Et du coup, t'es à quel conservatoire? CNSM peut-être? Mais t'as quel âge du coup? Ok. Ah, il est normalien. Ah putain, pardon, il a soutenu une thèse sur Kant sous la direction d'Alexis Filonenko. Et il enseigne dans mon université. Ah non, plus maintenant. Maintenant, c'est un businessman. Ah putain, oh, pardon, j'arrête pas de dire des gros mots, mais mon cœur a sauté, ça fait trop bizarre. Ça m'arrive des fois. Je vous rassure, tout va bien. Ah, c'est bien, il veut populariser la philosophie chez les jeunes. La philosophie du tatami. Je me demande si Raphaël l'a pas invité sur philosophie, sur Arte. Parce que la philosophie du tatami, ça me dit quelque chose. Michel Pouet. Ah non, on a déjà été invités ensemble, mais... Ah si, ouais. Enfin, il l'a invité, mais sur France Culture. Ouais, ils doivent se connaître. Parce qu'il travaille, je vois que Michel Pouech, il travaille avec ceux qui font les petits disciples de Socrate, et je sais qu'il aime beaucoup lire ça, faire lire ça à ses enfants, Raphaël. Ah oui, les machines ont-elles pris le pouvoir, je vois. C'est différent. Quelle vidéo je me présente? Et quels gens? Parce que la vidéo, si c'est la toute... Ah, il y a 5 personnes, bonjour. Si c'est la toute première vidéo de ma chaîne, effectivement, j'avais que 15 ans, donc... Je suis à Paris 4, Sorbonne Université. tantôt à Serpente, tantôt à heu, tantôt à Sorbonne, la Sorbonne même. En même temps, je comprends, ça devait être une émission de philosophie où je vois laquelle c'est. Non, mais non, il est pas radicalement opposé comme ça, hein. Je l'écoute depuis très, très longtemps, c'est devenu un ami. Ah oui, bah, je sais, je fais super jeune. Mais comment ça? Ça veut dire que les gens qui étaient à la jam ont vu ma vidéo de présentation? Après j'ai 22 ans, hein, je suis pas non plus, toi, tu as quel âge? Sérieux? Ah bah, toi non plus tu fais pas ton âge. Mais j'hallucine, mais en fait les trentenaires là, vous faites tous super jeunes, genre ou alors c'est moi qui vieillis et du coup en fait ça me paraît, genre j'ai l'impression qu'on a le même âge parce que c'est vrai, il y a pas trop tant de différence que ça. Mais quel âge d'anniv? Ah! Bon anniversaire donc. Et ouais, vous faites tous trop jeunes parce que, il y a des 2 personnes dans ma classe qui ont 30 ans, on dirait qu'elles ont mon âge. Ouais, mais même, c'est, pas que asiatique parce que, il y avait un Autrichien dans ma classe qui avait 30 ans l'année dernière et qui les faisait pas du tout. Cette année, bon cette année aussi c'est un asiatique, c'est vrai, mais l'année dernière, c'était un Autrichien, 30 ans. Quand j'ai su ça, je fais: «Quoi?» Parce qu'il était petit en fait. Mais même, il faisait pas 30 ans. Ah moi aussi! Non, si j'ai un peu changé parce que mon corps a changé quand même. Mais j'avoue que j'ai des habits que j'ai depuis très longtemps. Mais justement, j'essaie de changer. J'ai changé un peu ma garde-robe récemment parce que c'était plus possible en fait, ces habits-là. Ah mais tiens. Mmh. Bon après tu achètes un blazer et voilà, hein, c'est réglé. Un costard ou 2 si jamais ça doit aller aux salles. Mmh. Ah d'ailleurs, tiens, si jamais ça t'intéresse, hem, je viens de faire, un concert avec Rhoda Scott dans une chorale éphémère créée pour le projet. La première c'était samedi dernier à La Haye-les-Roses et la deuxième c'est Nogent le 21 janvier et ensuite à Wissous le 3 février. Voilà, j'imagine que tu connais Rhoda Scott et c'était trop cool. On joue des standards, quelques morceaux d'elle et c'est tout. Il y avait un morceau de notre chef Pierre-Gérard Verny mais c'était que pour le concert de Noël. C'était un chant de Noël. Alors je t'explique après et et c'est avec Frédéric Delestré à la batterie et heu, Ludo Alama au piano. En fait, j'étais dans une chorale qu'un an qui s'appelle Go Jazz, mais c'est pas vraiment du jazz et bon, le niveau était pas hyper élevé donc et c'était loin de chez moi. Donc finalement, je suis partie. Mais là-bas, il y a Franza Rajasson qui connaissait mon chef, qui cherchait des jeunes, qui savaient chanter et bouger pour la télé, pour une émission et du coup, bah, je me suis proposée et en fait, elle propose du coup régulièrement aux gens, qu'elle recrute comme ça, des projets, divers projets. tantôt bénévoles, tantôt rémunérés, tantôt c'est nous qui devons payer. Là, c'était nous qui devions payer, c'était sous forme de stage, le projet avec Rhoda Scott, et évidemment. Et en plus, ce qui est drôle, c'est que ma mère a chanté il y a 30 ans avec Rhoda Scott. Elle est chef de chœur, prof de solfège aussi, et voilà, donc Rhoda Scott m'a dit: «Dans 30 ans, je jouerai avec votre fille». Elle aura 115 ans, mais et voilà, donc c'est comme ça. Et du coup, si tu tapes, l'orgue et les voix, Rhoda Scott éventuellement, nos gens, bah, tu devrais tomber sur les liens de billetterie. Mais j'espère qu'ils vont bien régler la sono parce que c'était trop fort. Ah là, et les roses, les instruments. Alors, je ils sont peut-être obligés parce que l'orgue, il faut qu'il soit monté jusqu'à 11 pour que ça ressorte. Mais du coup, on n'entendait pas assez les voix et c'était trop sonorisé. Bon, ça devrait être mieux à nos gens, je pense. Ah ouais, non, mais c'est une catastrophe, hein. Tu obligé de mettre des boules caisses pour aller au concert, c'est quand même incroyable. Pas que de pop. J'étais allée, voir, Vladimir Cosma au Grand Rex là. Ils ont sonorisé l'orchestre symphonique. Ah oui, mais Marciac de toute façon c'est plus un festival de jazz, comme beaucoup de festivals de jazz. Ah mais c'est une horreur, hein. Les festivals en plus c'est pire. Ouais, ça saturait dans les aigus, c'était horrible. Même sur scène. Ah ouais? Tant mieux. Ah voilà. Non, ça devrait être mieux à nos gens quand même. Donc, the purely harmonic view also fails, because it treats harmonic features as definitional or essential, where those features are regarded as historically contingent by many jazz players and writers. In the late 1950s and 1960s, many jazz leaders, such as Ornette Coleman, excluded the piano from their groups precisely because the piano imposed unwanted harmonic structure on improvisations. Intéressant. On improvisations that sought to transcend the mere elaboration of chord changes. Copier-coller. The numbers on albums such as Free Jazz were structured motivatically, rather than harmonically. Motif. Where the motifs suggested by one player informed the solos of subsequent players. Other players, for example Rollins in On Green Dolphin Street, had constructed solos through permutation of small motivic elements, but their techniques were employed to solo on the chord changes of the relevant songs. Coleman, on the other hand, employed motivic construction as a substitute for harmonic elaboration. As such, his numbers cannot be captured by any version of the canonical model that requires harmonic equivalence, least of all the revision of the canonical model that places its entire weight on harmonic equivalence. To be more precise, the harmonic revision of the canonical model can capture Coleman's numbers only by rejecting them as standardly repeatable works. In other words, a proponent of the canonical model can claim that since Coleman's numbers on free jazz contain no harmonic structure, and since harmonic structure determines whether two performances are instances of the same work, one of two consequences follows: either Coleman's performances are necessarily works with only a single instance of all jazz performances without harmonic structure are instances of the same work. Although the claim that certain works are by their nature confined to a single instance is plausible for works that are entirely free, it is a more dubious claim that when applied to works such as Coleman's that are elaborations on some sort of structure. Instructions, sorry. The second claim, that all performances lacking in harmonic structure are instances of the same work, does not bear serious consideration. We must conclude that neither the canonical model nor any simple revision of it adequately captures our intuitions concerning the identity of all works of jazz. Nevertheless, we share the intuition that Ornette Coleman played the same number more than once. That is, two performances by Coleman can be said to instantiate the same number. This is the case since each of these performances conforms to a set of instructions. These instructions do not take the form specified by the canonical model, but the guidelines exist all the same. Sometimes, as on the album The Shape of Jazz to Come, numbers are organized in terms of motifs. Here, the guidelines that define a work specify conformity to certain motifs. Although the canonical model gives a satisfactory account of how many jazz performances instantiate the same work, it does not work for all cases. No completely general account of the guidelines that define jazz work is possible. They vary from jazz genre to jazz genre. In some genres, including free jazz, number-defining instructions may not exist. In these cases, either there is no work at all, or we have works that are instantiated only in a single performance. We leave this metaphysical issue to be debated by others. An interesting set of issues arises when we consider the addition or omission of lyrics. When jazz musicians appropriate numbers from Tin Pan Alley's Summertime My romance doesn't have to have a moon in the sky. My romance doesn't need a blue lagoon standing by, and so on, it seems clear enough that they perform instrumental versions of the original songs. The melody, harmony, and so on remain constant. The addition of lyrics is a harder case. Consider, for example, In Walked Bud by Monk, to which Jon Hendricks subsequently added words. Dizzy was screaming, Netsobi was beaming among the stamping, Sammy walked the Netland needed pop. Similarly, Stoned by saxophonist Walter Gray was originally an instrumental composition. Annie Ross put lyrics to the tune of this number and gave the resulting song the title Twisted. The jazz world regards performances of the vocal version of In Walked Bud as instances of the original composition. Still, the question of whether performances with and without lyrics can instantiate the same standard is a puzzling one. A case can be made for both sides of this question. On the one hand, one could argue that performances with lyrics cannot be instances of wordless numbers. It could be argued that nothing in the tacit guidelines of a wordless number guides in any way the choice of lyrics a singer performs. By way of contrast, nothing in the addition of a piano part is completely uninfluenced by the original instructions. Of course, a performer will vary the melody and fill in harmonies, but the melody and harmony are both influenced by the starting point. This could be taken as evidence that a performance with lyrics is not an instance of a wordless number. Where the introduction of scat singing fits into this picture is not entirely clear. On the other hand, one could argue that a performance with words can follow a set of guidelines sufficiently closely to count as a performance of the work defined by the guidelines. After all, the melody, harmony, and so on specified by the guidelines may be observed. Ok. Ok. La version de chat de In Walked Bud ou My Romance? Du coup, le 3 février, c'est à Vissou. My Romance. Je connais pas. Moi, je connais celle de Laurence Saltiel, que tu connais peut-être d'ailleurs. C'est mon père au piano. Et du Real Group. Je suis absolument fan du Real Group. C'est comme ça que j'ai connu le standard, en fait. Section 5, et on a presque fini l'article. Philosophers have not favorably regarded the account of the metaphysics of jazz offered in this essay. Mon Dieu, il est beaucoup trop tard. We have argued that two jazz performances, even when they involve improvisation, can be instances of a single type. To the extent that philosophers have considered this question, they have tended to hold that jazz performances are sui generis. In this section, we will defend our position against some possible objections. The few writers who have considered the question of whether two improvised performances can be instances of a common type have held that they cannot be. Andy Hamilton dismisses as a pseudo-problem the question of whether two jazz performances are instances of a single type. Philip Alperson apparently thinks it makes sense to ask whether two improvised performances, including jazz performances, instantiate the same type, but he believes they never do. On the contrary, he thinks that each jazz performance is a type with only a single token. Hamilton gives no arguments for thinking that the problem addressed in this essay is a pseudo-problem, so we cannot defend ourselves against his objection. Alperson, however, provides arguments that need to be addressed. Alperson considers and rejects something like our account of the metaphysics of jazz. In particular, he considers the suggestion that two improvised performances can be instances of the same megatype. Joseph Margolis introduced the concept of a megatype into the aesthetics literature. Two artworks belong to the same megatype just in case they share approximately the same design. So, for example, two manuscripts of a Donnay poem, which differ slightly from each other, belong to the same megatype. It might be thought that two jazz performances could similarly belong to the same megatype. Jolie façon pratique de résoudre le problème. Alperson argues that this proposal is mistaken. When a performance is improvised, he reasons, there is no notated score. An improvised performance, he concludes, cannot belong to a megatype in virtue of fidelity to such a score. Neither can an improvised performance belong to a megatype in virtue of fidelity to a prime performance. A prime performance is the one that establishes a megatype. By definition, an improvised performance, Alperson would hold, is not one designed to be faithful to some past performance. He concludes that the metaphysics of improvised performances resembles the metaphysics of sculptures in wood or marble. On Alperson's view, both improvised performances and hewn sculptures are sui generis. Alperson's argument establishes only that completely spontaneous improvisations do not belong to a megatype. As we have seen, however, most jazz performances are not completely spontaneous. In many cases, jazz musicians create performances that are simultaneously improvised in the sense identified above and faithful to a set of guidelines established by a tradition of jazz performance. Fidelity to such guidelines makes a performance an instance of some jazz standard. Moreover, two performances that are faithful to a single set of guidelines will resemble each other. Consequently, they are, in Margulies' terminology, tokens of some megatype. Alperson's metaphysics is, however, applicable to completely spontaneous performances of jazz. 6. Much remains to be said about the metaphysics of jazz. Some important issues have been touched upon here, but left for resolution by others. Still, the basis has emerged for an account of how two jazz performances can instantiate the same work. Jazz works are defined not by scores, but by sets of tacit guidelines for performance. Two performances, even when they involve improvisation, can follow these guidelines and be said to instantiate the same jazz standard. No completely general account can be given of these guidelines, which differ from one period and style of jazz to another. Not every jazz performance conforms to a work-defining set of guidelines. Consequently, not every jazz performance is an instance of a jazz number. Still, some do conform to a work-defining set of guidelines, and performances by Monk and Davis can be instances of the same work, just as surely as performances by Ashkenazi and Van Immersiel can be. Je copie-colle quelque chose. Et ensuite, ce sont des notes. Pas beaucoup de notes. Our view here is influenced by the account of works in the performing arts offered in Paul Thumb for an audience, Temple University Press. See, for example, Ted Gioa, The Imperfect Art, New York, Oxford University Press. The very nature of jazz demands spontaneity. Were the jazz artist to approach his music in a methodical and calculated manner, he would cease to be an improviser and become a composer. For a related point, see Lee B. Brown, Musical Works, Improvisation, and the Principle of Continuity, je vais lire ça aussi, in the Journal of Aesthetic and Art Criticism. Nelson Goodman, Languages of Art. The article on improvisation in the New Grove Dictionary of Music, volume 9, édition Stanley Sadie, recognizes that some improvisations are completely spontaneous while others are not. For the claim that musical compositions originate with a particular composer at a particular time and place, see Gerard Levinson, What a Musical Work Is, the Journal of Philosophy. Peter Kivey, Authenticities. It is worth noting that in the 17th century it was quite common to write a set of variations on a Baroque standard without stating the melody being varied. Still, contemporaries would take the composition to be an instance of, say, Greensleeves. Andy Hamilton, The Aesthetics of Imperfection, Philosophy. Since Hamilton does not indicate why he thinks questions of identity of artworks are a pseudo-problem. J'ai mal aux yeux. We cannot undertake to refute his position. Hamilton seems not to have redeemed his promise to return to this matter on another occasion. Philip Alperson on musical improvisation, The Journal of Aesthetic and Art Criticism. Je vais quand même pas aller lire ça aussi, c'est infini, j'ai trop de choses à lire, au secours, j'arriverai jamais à écrire ce mémoire. Joseph Margolis, Art and Philosophy, Brighton, Harvester Press, 1980. Ok. Bon, bah, je vais quand même copier-coller cette note là de Philip Alperson on musical improvisation dans le Journal of Aesthetic and Art Criticism. Et on a fini pour cet article. Putain, j'ai trop mal aux yeux. Ouais, elle va arrêter d'ailleurs d'enseigner à Cergy, je crois. Ou à, je sais plus, à Boulogne. Oh, j'ai mal. Mon père, c'est Joël Bouquet, je sais pas si tu vois. Il l'accompagne souvent dans ses stages et tout. The Real Group, c'est des Suédois. Ils chantent tantôt des standards qu'ils arrangent, tantôt des compos à eux. C'est beaucoup Anders Edenroth qui a écrit leurs compositions. Les plus connus, c'est Words. Words, a letter and a letter on a string will hold forever humanity spellbound words, possession of the beggar and the king. Everybody, every day, you and I, we all can say words. Yeah, Pass Me the Jazz. Pass Me the Jazz. Non, c'est pas ma mère, Laurence Saltiel. Non, juste ils travaillent ensemble. Ah, merci Véronique Genicel. Pass me the jazz, homemade and hot. I wanna get in the groove to the bottom of the beat, so keep it cooking and stomp your feet. Pass me the jazz, all that you've got. Put temptation in my way with a bottle of blues and a flavor of fun. Dig, dig, dig it and dig it. Ça module 36 millions de fois ce truc. Je te conseille d'écouter si tu connais pas The Real Group. C'est du jazz vocal a cappella. Soprane, alto, ténor, baryton, basse. Et maintenant, ils ont totalement changé de leurs membres. C'est des jeunes, mais ils sont toujours vivants. Et jusqu'il y a pas longtemps, c'était encore les membres fondateurs. C'est toujours Anders Edenroth qui écrit des choses pour eux, d'ailleurs. C'est le ténor, Anders Edenroth. Il y a ça qui est connu, et puis il y a Chili Con Carne aussi. Pink some brand and fresh tomatoes, put them in a bowl with oil, and ensuite, but don't forget the Mexican spices, the spices, the art of the cooking. Oh no, don't forget the Mexican spices. The sunshine, chili con carne, 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 con chili con carne. Aha, let's make chili con carne, chili con carne. Voilà. Normal. Je sais pas comment ça ressort en plus en live comme ça doit pas être terrible. Voilà, ben moi je vais dormir parce que là oh là là. Je dois me lever à seulement 10h30 demain, mais j'ai besoin de 10 heures de sommeil par nuit, donc là les calculs sont pas bons, Kevin, comme dirait l'autre. Donc je te dis bonne nuit aussi. Déjà pourquoi tu ça, j ça me fascine. Il y a des gens qui écoutent mes lives à 2 heures du matin au lieu de faire dodo. Bonne nuit. Parce qu'on était il y a un moment, on était 5 quand même. Ça veut dire qu'en plus de toi, il y a 4 personnes. Ouais, non, c'est fou, moi aussi, c'est pas bien. Parce qu'en vrai, je suis un gros bébé et à 21 heures mes yeux, ils commencent à se fermer. Mais ça veut dire qu'il y a 4 personnes en plus qui écoutaient ça à 1 heure du matin, quoi. Ah ouais, non, moi, c'est juste, je suis une grosse flemmarde. J'ai même la flemme d'aller me coucher. Mais le problème, c'est qu'en fait, on voit, mon lit est en hauteur. Donc pour aller me coucher, je dois monter des escaliers. Donc j'ai la flemme d'aller dormir. Donc je reste sur mon canapé. Bref. La flemme va très, très loin. Plus ça avance, faut se brosser les dents, tout ça, tout ça. Voilà. Bah, il est trop petit, les 2 petits. Autant j'ai un lit qui fait 1 place et demie, alors que mon canapé, il est petit, quoi. Donc c'est quand même plus confortable. Autant utiliser mon lit, j'en ai un vrai lit. Là, je risque de tomber. Là, ouais, j'ai vécu longtemps là-dedans. Là, c'est un petit studio, mais enfin, c'est 12 m², hein. J'ai vécu dans un 10 m² pendant 3 ans. 7e étage sans ascenseur, toilette sur le palier, qui fermait avec un cordon. Heu, ouais et ouais, j'ai oublié un truc, non? 10 m², toilette sur le palier, 7e sans ascenseur. Bah, quand on passe à 12 avec, des toilettes à l'intérieur et une mezzanine et un canapé, c'est bien. Et une vraie cuisine parce que mon lavabo me servait d'évier aussi. Ça doit être ton cas? Ouais, c'était horrible. Très froid l'hiver, très chaud l'été. Puis j'avais un petit chauffage à huile là, mais c'était bien quand même. Mais là, c'est mieux. Tu sais combien de mètres carrés toi? Toi bah, comme moi, toilette de palier. Bah, mais c'est pourquoi heureusement? Ah ouais 9 mètres, putain ça devrait être interdit. Pourquoi heureusement? Parce que moi aussi j'avais des toilettes sur le palier, mais du coup c'est pas bien parce que c'est pas dans ton appart. Puis j'avais des voisins qui laissaient leur porte ouverte H24, juste à côté des toilettes. Et là, c'était un couple et la meuf, elle téléphonait à la fenêtre en face des toilettes. Donc moi j'osais plus sortir des toilettes parce qu'elle était juste derrière la porte au téléphone et j'entendais tout. Ah! Ouais. Après normalement ça pue pas tant que ça, je sais pas. Ouais, non mais si 9 m², j'avoue, bah oui forcément. Alors que moi j'ai une porte qui ferme là, moi. Enfin qui ferme. J'ai une porte. Déjà c'est bien, j'ai une porte. Une salle de bain. Ouais, mais du coup, enfin je sais pas s'il y a d'autres personnes qui l'utilisent, mais moi il y avait en fait une dame qui l'utilisait, mais juste une partie de l'année, donc ça va, j'étais tranquille, mais et avec ses voisins là, ils laissaient tout le temps leurs poubelles dans le couloir aussi. Ça coulait dans le couloir, c'est dégueulasse. Ça puait dans le couloir. Ils jetaient leurs mégots par la fenêtre aussi, les bouteilles de bière, du coup ça tombait sur les voisins en dessous, enfin bref. Quand qui avait chié sur le sol des toilettes? Ah ouais, ça. Je suis en train de me dire: «Mais qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, dans la tête de ce monsieur pour qu'il fasse ça? Qu'est-ce qu'il avait pris comme substance, tout ça?» Ouais, j'adore comment on fait totalement une conversation privée en live sur YouTube. Parce que là, il y a plus personne là. Beaucoup enfin, vous êtes courageux les gens si vous êtes restés jusque là en replay. Ouais, pourquoi? C'est un chien qui aimait pas Freud. Ouais, d'accord. Bah, je me demande qui a fait ça. Non, j'ai très mal à la tête. Ouais. Quel genre de personne a fait ça, genre? Je te redis bonne nuit et puis je vais mourir, du coup. Adieu. Oh, sérieux? Avec qui? De quoi? De quand? De comment? De quoi? Je note. 14 décembre. C'est un quel jour ça? Jeudi. Ah, je peux pas. Je finis à 21h. Ah, mais si, il y a peut-être un concert plus tard. C'est que à 20h30. Parce qu'en plus, j'aurais pas mangé à 21h. Oh, il y a Alfredo Rodriguez. Du thé Lombard. 7 et 9 décembre, mais je pourrais pas venir non plus. Ouais, ça me dit quelque chose. Ah, organiste aussi. Ah, c'est un jeune, c'est pour ça que je le connais pas. Tu me diras, Alfredo Rodriguez aussi, il est jeune. Il a quel âge? Il est un peu plus. Il a 38 ans. Ah ouais! Compagnon de Cécile McLorin. Ok. Bon, mais à bientôt. Du coup, malheureusement, je suis désolée, je suis pas au 14 décembre. Peut-être au 3 février, peut-être avant. Rebonne nuit. Ah si, c'est donc c'est que à 20h30. ou jouer un autre jour.